and the Miami, Florida Monnet Center of Excellence. I want to thank Christine Callie for all of your organizing and helping me to get here. I also want to thank the FIU Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program as well for hosting this. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, not just because I got to escape the snow in New York, which I'm really grateful for, and thank you for bringing the sunshine for me. But this is really meaningful for me to be able to present to you. I am the child and the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. It's really meaningful for me to speak to you as part of this really important week, and the events look amazing, so check out the QR code when the talk is done. So the title of my talk is Combating Anti-Semitism in the European Union, Opportunities, Tools, and Challenges. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about some main questions that I'd like to go over, and then whatever I don't quite get to finish up, we're going to have some question and answer time at the end. So if there's anything that I talked about that you're unsure, please ask questions and I'm happy to dig in a little bit more. But the main questions that I want to talk about are, why should we even be addressing anti-Semitism? Why is anti-Semitism important? Why is it important for the European Union to address anti-Semitism? And then we'll look at what tools the European Union has to actually address the concern of anti-Semitism. And then we'll look a little bit about, what have been the outcomes. It's a very new policy, so it's very early to say it's been successful or not successful, but I'll try to point out some things that have had some impact and some change within the European Union. So let me start with this first question of, why even talk about anti-Semitism? Why is it important? And I always like to say, when you think about anti-Semitism, it's not just about Jew hate. It is about Jew hate, but it's also an important threat that you need to pay attention to. It is a threat to democracy. And let me explain why that is. So first of all, you can think about anti-Semitism as something related to civil rights, right? If you discriminate against Jews, if you discriminate against a protected category, race, religion, ethnicity, and Jews possibly could fall under any of those, that is anti-democratic, right? That is not the way we think about democracy, which is inclusive and non-discriminatory. But here's the other piece that's really important to think about with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. And Deborah Lipstadt, who is the anti-Semitism envoy for the United States, often says that. And what she means by that is that when you see the rise of anti-Semitism, it is often accompanied by other kinds of hate, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's racism, and other groups. So it's the canary in the coal mine. You need to pay attention to it. The other thing about anti-Semitism is that a great deal of anti-Semitism is surrounded by conspiracy theories. And those conspiracy theories are ideas that the Jews control the banks, the Jews control government, the Jews control power, which is not true. But these are the kinds of conspiracy theories that float out there. Maybe you've heard some of them. The Jews created COVID. The Jews created the vaccine to cure COVID. Have you heard that one? It's out there. So think about that. If people believe that this small group of individuals, the Jews, whatever that means, right? The Jews control everything. What does that mean for democracy? It delegitimizes the state. It undermines democracy. And in the most extreme forms, it's a source of violence, which of course in any democratic society, we expect a peaceful sort of society. So this is why anti-Semitism is important. It's not just about Jew hatred. It's about a threat to democracy, which we should all be concerned about. So why should the European Union care about it? So here's a quote from Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission. So the European Union is a supranational organization. So what that means is it's a level of government that is above the state. And this is the executive branch of the European Union, and she is the president of that executive body. She's already served as president for the past 5 years, and she's just been reappointed for a new commission term, which has just started. And this is a quote from her from 2020, and it states, "Our fight against anti-Semitism is more urgent than ever. Anti-Semitism is on the rise across Europe. Anti-Semitism is a poison for our democratic values and an attack on our way of life." And notice that quote, it's from 2020, well before October 7th, okay? So even prior to October 7th, leadership within the European Union was noticing the rise of anti-Semitism. I'll talk a little bit more about that and what that looked like. But the European Union is a club of democracies. That's the way we EU scholars think about it. It's a club of democracies. You must be a democratic country to become a member. And oftentimes you will hear leaders of the European Union say that the European Union was created on the ashes of World War II. And you will also specifically hear Ursula von der Leyen and Katharina von Schnorbein, who is the EU envoy of the European Union, will say that the ashes of World War II are also built upon the ashes of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And that's not lost on European leadership. And this is why the European Union is really paying attention to the rise of anti-Semitism, because we know that in a European context, the rise of anti-Semitism led to the destruction of democracy across Europe in the 20th century. And of course, the murder, the intended murder and genocide of 6 million Jews and 6 million other groups, right? People of other groups. So this isn't lost on the leadership of the European Union. However, it's taken the EU a little bit of time to actually come up with a policy. As I mentioned, this policy is relatively new, and I want to walk you through a little bit of that history. But before I do that, I want to show you some figures just to kind of place you as to, what am I talking about? There's anti-Semitism in Europe and even before October 7th. So in 2018 and in 2023, and notice that this survey, so this is a survey that the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is an organization within the European Union, they do a lot of data collecting and helping member states with certain issues related to fundamental rights. They did a survey of Jewish perceptions of their experience within Europe. One was done in 2018, and then a very similar was done in 2023. And I want you to note the date. It goes from January of 23 till June. This data does not pick up post-October 7th. And I want you to look at these numbers, because these numbers, they're not good. So if you just look through, and so this is from public opinion, right? So people saying, a Jewish person, do you think anti-Semitism has increased in your country in the last 5 years? 88% said yes, 81% in 2023. Anti-Semitism is considered a fairly big or very big problem in their country. 85% of Jews across Europe said yes, 84% in 2023. How many have experienced anti-Semitic harassment? A third of the population, 31% in 2018, and it gets even higher, 37% in 2023. Experienced offline anti-Semitic harassment, 26% and 32% in 2023. I don't have the exact same question for this last one, but encountered anti-Semitism online and offline. I'm going to talk a little bit about the online piece of it when we talk about some of the tools. 90% of Jews said, yeah, I've seen it online. I've experienced it online. It's a really dangerous space, and we'll talk about that. And 77% have experienced it offline. So these numbers are kind of frightening. This is from the 2023 survey that I wanted to pull out some of these. Worry for their own safety. 53% of Jews that were surveyed worry for their own safety. 60% worry for their family safety. 37% have experienced verbal abuse and harassment. 4% physical attacks. They're kind of shocking numbers, okay? Now, let's take a look at what happened after October 7th. So the data that I have here, and you're probably like, how come you don't have all 27 member states? So one of the challenges that I have with this research is that many countries do not measure the amount of anti-Semitism that exists in their country. So the data isn't great across all 27 member states. So I cherry-picked a little bit. I have the countries that actually collect the data and the largest Jewish communities in Europe, okay? So just take a look at this. And by the way, in 2022, for all of these countries, was like the highest rates they had until that point of anti-Semitism experience in their country. Look at 2023. Austria, 59.5% increase in anti-Semitism. France, 384% increase in anti-Semitism. Germany, 93% increase. Italy, 88%. Netherlands, 311% increase in the rates of anti-Semitic events that were recorded. Again, these aren't great numbers. And by the way, if you dig into this data a little bit more, what you will find is that most of that increase happened within 2 weeks after October 7th. So within a very short amount of time explains that increase in those numbers. That's how intense it was after October 7th. It's important to note that because if you talk about 2 weeks after October 7th happened, keep in mind, Israel hadn't even gone into Gaza yet. The day of October 7th, there were events that were happening, attacking synagogues and things going on in the streets. So there's latent anti-Semitism there. It's not just about, October 7th. By the way, just to sort of place us, I know we're talking about Europe, but in the United States, 2023, according to the FBI hate crime statistics, there was an increase of 63% in 2023 of anti-Semitic hate crimes. Jews make up 2% of the US population, and they make up 15% of all the hate crimes in this country. So think about that, okay? All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about the policy itself. So I've kind of placed you what the landscape looks like, but let's talk about the policy to address anti-Semitism and where it comes from. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background, a little bit of history, so bear with me for a moment. And I want to make the argument, I know I just showed you like 2022, 2023, but I want to make the argument that the rise of anti-Semitism, we've seen that increase in Europe, and I would say even in the United States, starting around 2000. And there are several events and several things that tell us that there has been a rise in anti-Semitism. I'm going to focus in on Europe, but some of those things are, first of all, 9/11. After 9/11, and you probably had heard these things, there were conspiracy theories that Jews were actually the perpetrators of 9/11. Now we know that Al-Qaeda are the perpetrators of 9/11. Nonetheless, there were these conspiracy theories, again, going back to the conspiracy theories, they were out there in the world, those theories. And there was actually a book that became very popular across Europe talking about this. And you start to see an uptick in anti-Semitism in Europe. And because of that uptick in anti-Semitism, the European Union, now at the time, so I showed you data from the Fundamental Rights Agency, the sort of precursor to that institution was called the EU Monitoring Commission. And that organization, realizing that, it looks like anti-Semitism might be on the rise, created a study to try to measure, is there really a rise in anti-Semitism? And this is in 2003. And what was really interesting about that report, and I'm gonna condense this a little bit, but what happened was, the report was made, so they contracted out a third party, an organization in Germany to do the report. And when the report was released back to the European Union, the EU wanted to bury the report. The reason why the EU wanted to bury the report was that what's very interesting about this report is it makes the argument using data that the rise of anti-Semitism was coming from the political right, the far right, which we usually expect, the political left, and Muslim extremists. And the reason why the EU wanted to bury this report was that Muslims in Europe are a group that have been victimized, right? We all know about Islamophobia. In Europe, the EU tends to use the term anti-Muslim hate, but we know this is a problem in Europe. And so the EU didn't want to release this report because now we're showing a group that's victimized as an oppressor, right? As somebody committing a hate crime or something like that. So they didn't want the information to get out. The German organization slipped the study to the press. It all came out, so now the EU had to release that study. And that study showed that there was an increase in anti-Semitism. And again, what's really interesting about that study is saying it's not just coming from the right, which is what we usually expect. It's coming from the political left, and it's coming from Muslim extremists. Okay, so that was something that was kind of interesting about that study, and it's showing, using data, an increase in anti-Semitism across Europe. And I want to talk about some disturbing events. There are more than what I'm going to tell you, but these were the ones that I think were the most sort of public, noteworthy. In 2006, there is the torture and murder of a young man, Ilan Halimi, in France. He was taken hostage, he was tortured, and he ended up dying of the wounds and so on that were inflicted upon him. It was a horrible event. It became very public. But what was odd about that event as it was unfolding and a little bit in its aftermath is that the press did not cover it as an anti-Semitic attack. They just said, oh, this young man was tortured, and they left out the fact that he was a Jew, and they targeted him because he was a Jew. The family really pushed back. I mean, today there is a park in his memory, and it says that Ilan Halimi was the victim of anti-Semitism. Okay, but at the time, it really wasn't looked at as an anti-Semitic attack. In 2012, we have the attack in Toulouse, France. It was a shooting that was perpetrated by an Islamic extremist at a Jewish day school. A rabbi is killed, and 3 small children are slaughtered on the streets of Toulouse. Again, the French press looks at this event and says, oh, why would somebody become an extremist? Because they're not included in French society. But they didn't say it was an anti-Semitic attack. Why would they target a synagogue? Why did they kill the rabbi? Right? That piece was left out of the media. 2012, we have a bus explosion in Bulgaria, and it was committed by Hezbollah. It killed 5 Israelis and the Bulgarian bus driver. 2014, we're going to have the attack on the Belgian Jewish Museum. 4 people are killed in that attack. Now maybe we're talking a little bit more about anti-Semitism related to these events, but the EU isn't doing anything. 2015 is going to be the watershed moment. 2015, we have the attack on Charlie Hebdo, which I think you guys are aware of. So Charlie Hebdo is a French satirical newspaper, and they had posted comics with pictures, depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, and which is offensive in Islam. And so Charlie Hebdo was targeted by Islamic extremists. And again, these are extremists. I'm not saying the Muslim world, I'm saying extremists. So just be very clear what I'm saying. So it was a violent attack on Charlie Hebdo. They attacked the headquarters and then went down the street and targeted a kosher supermarket, entered that kosher supermarket and killed 4 people in the kosher supermarket. It was not an accident that it was a kosher supermarket. It was targeted. And then a month later in Copenhagen, there was a shooting outside of a synagogue and 2 people are murdered. So within 1 month span, we have these 2 very public, very violent anti-Semitic attacks across different European countries, and the EU takes notice. finally the EU is going to take notice. And what happens is in 2015, the head of, so within the commission, that executive body that I mentioned earlier, the individual who is head of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is like the Bill of Rights in the European Union, Frans Timmermans, is someone who, he's Dutch, and he's kind of, if you look at his background and some of the speeches he's given, he has a certain interest in Holocaust memory, Holocaust awareness, interest in the Jewish community. And so after these events, he decides to run a colloquium on both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And out of that colloquium is the creation of the coordinator's office to combat anti-Semitism and, by the way, a coordinator's office to combat anti-Muslim hate. Both of those institutions are created within the commission, both in 2015. So this is where, so we can kind of target 2015 as the beginning of the European Union engaging in a policy to address anti-Semitism. So the office is created, again, within the commission, the executive body. Katharina von Schnorbein is the anti-Semitism coordinator. She kind of heads that office, is appointed at that point. In 2017, various EU institutions, so the Commission, which is the executive body, the Council of the European Union, and I'm going to come back to that institution a few times. The Council of the European Union represents the member states. And it also has a co-legislative function. And what's important about that is when the Council says something, it means the member states are saying, this is a goal we want to achieve. This is something that is important to us, okay? And then we have the European Parliament, which has also a co-legislative function that they share with the Council of the European Union, all right? So this is kind of like the three main institutions that I'm going to cover. We also have European Union Court of Justice, which I'll also talk a little bit about. But the IRA definition, and you're probably like, what does that stand for? So it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. The Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that definition, believe it or not, actually comes out of the European Union. The EU, back in like 2005, was got some people together to work on a definition. They created a definition, it's a working definition. It does not have legal teeth, so that you understand that. It's a working definition, and the way that it defines anti-Semitism is, bless you, a very short definition, but then it goes into say, like, how can anti-Semitism express itself? And anti-Semitism is a shapeshifter. And I can't go deeply into the definition because that would be a whole other lecture. I'd love to come back another time and give you another lecture on that, but we don't have enough time. But what it does is it lays out different ways that anti-Semitism can express itself. Why is it important that the EU institutions by 2017 have all adopted this definition? Because if you can define something, you can create policy around it. If you can't define it, how are you going to create policy, right? So it's really important that now these EU institutions are saying, this is what anti-Semitism is, more or less, and then we can design policy around it. So that happens in 2017. 2018, if you remember, 2018 is when that public survey comes out about how Jews feel across Europe, and the EU is like, whoa, things are really bad, we need to do something. The Council, so this is a representation of member states, creates a declaration to address anti-Semitism. That means all the member states are saying, hey, this is something really important. Now, does it mean member states are all going to do something? No, it doesn't. So just keep that in mind. Member states maintain their sovereignty within the EU. So we'll see this as sort of, we'll talk a little bit more as I dig into some of the tools. 2020. The Council makes another declaration on what's called mainstreaming the fight against anti-Semitism across policy areas. So first of all, Germany holds the presidency of the European Union at that time. It's not an accident that the Germans are like, hey, we want to put anti-Semitism on the front burner of what the EU does. Mainstreaming, what that means is you take anti-Semitism and you put it into other policy areas. Like, for example, you can put it into foreign policy. And this happened. The European Parliament, on a few occasions, held up funding to UNRWA, and some of you might be aware of what UNRWA is, but that's the UN organization that provides aid to both Gaza and the West Bank, to the Palestinian territories, okay? And the reason why the money was held up is that there were studies done that UNRWA was writing textbooks for children with explicitly anti-Semitic and even violent parts in children's textbooks that were going out to kids in the Palestinian territories. And so the EU held up funding as part of this mainstream. By the way, they eventually released the funding because they're like, the Palestinians really need this aid. And so, little kids are being trained in anti-Semitism. It's not good, right? But unfortunately, those were moments where the mainstreaming, is happening. Like one of the other ones when I was doing interviews, they're like, Tu B'Shvat, which is a Jewish holiday for trees, is now being incorporated into like when the EU does their climate policy, environmental policy things, they want to include Jewish culture and they talk about Tu B'Shvat and planting trees. Now, it's a little something, but anyways, so this is what I mean by mainstreaming, is trying to think about anti-Semitism across different policy areas. And by the way, they've actually mainstreamed across, like they said in my interviews, it was something like 21 or 22 policy areas. So they are, thinking about it. The big moment is 2021, when the Commission creates a formal strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And what's really interesting is the second piece of this title, and foster Jewish life. And one of the things that I found in my interviews of various Jewish organizations is that they say, it's all fine and good that they talk about the Holocaust or, the past, but we're a living, breathing community now, and we want to flourish. We want to be able to practice our religion and be a part of European society. And it was actually Ursula von der Leyen who added that second piece, and foster Jewish life. I don't know of any other program in the EU that kind of has that idea behind it. So the strategy was created in October of 2021, and the EU loves to create pillars. Everything's a pillar. So there are 3 pillars of this strategy: preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, protecting and fostering Jewish life in the EU, and then education, research, and Holocaust remembrance is the other pillar of that of the strategy. So I want to talk a little bit, because I know these are really vague, and there's actually a lot of different tools that are part of this strategy. But what I want to do is kind of pull out some of the ones that I think are, kind of interesting and maybe more relevant for all of you, because you all do stuff online. So I'm going to back up a little bit time-wise here. So one of the tools that the European Union has to address anti-Semitism is actually a tool that was created much earlier than the strategy that I just mentioned to you. It's not specific to anti-Semitism, but you'll see there's pieces of anti-Semitism addressed in here. So this is called the Council Framework Decision of 2008. Let me explain kind of what does that mean as a council framework. So this comes out of the Council of the European Union, the member states. It is not an EU law per se, but what the EU does is it sets out certain goals. You are to achieve these goals, and you member states, and this is where the EU and sovereignty issue of member states comes in, you, the member states, decide how you want to achieve that goal. So you need to achieve this goal, but you can decide how you want to do it, okay? If you just give me a minute, I want to read the formal framework to you. I couldn't get it up on the slide, so I just would like to read it. I want you to listen to the language of this. So each member state shall take the measures necessary to ensure that the following intentional conduct is punishable, okay? That makes it criminal. Publicly inciting to violence or hatred directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Part B, the commission of an act referred to in point A, which I just read to you, by public dissemination or distribution of tracts, pictures, or other material. Now we're talking about online content, right? C, publicly condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin when the conduct is carried out in a manner likely to incite to violence or hatred against such a group or a member of such a group. That last piece, what are they talking about? The Holocaust. In Europe, you cannot deny, trivialize the Holocaust. Now I know in the US, we have freedom of speech. It's, you cannot touch it. In Europe, they're saying, no, you can't do that because if it can incite violence, it is not allowed. So that was created in 2008. Member states were supposed to what we call transpose, meaning create the legal mechanisms to then fulfill the goal that was set forth. Well, they're not going to do a very good job of that. And what happened was the EU said, all right, these countries should achieve this by 2010, but because the Lisbon Treaty had just been created in 2009 and member states had to do a lot of stuff to meet the Lisbon Treaty, they told the Commission in 2014, write a report and tell us how all the countries are doing regarding the 2008 framework. The report comes out in 2014, and sure enough, several countries, and I'll show you some of these, several countries had not met the mark. So this is in 2014 that the Commission records exactly who are the bad actors, so before I go, I'm sorry, I went too fast. So who are the bad actors? And the EU does nothing. 2020 happens. 2020, we have the murder of George Floyd here in the United States. And we in the United States had a reckoning with race, so did Europe. And there's a famous speech that Ursula von der Leyen gave before the European Parliament. And basically, like, a part of the speech is like, look at all of us, we're all white. Like, this is ridiculous. What are we doing? We need to create an action plan to address racism. And so the EU created, in August of 2020, the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan. It's a 5-year plan. By the way, the strategy for anti-Semitism is a 10-year plan. This is a 5-year plan. The 5-year plan has been renewed, by the way. So the new commission is supposed to be working on a new plan. But in that new plan, it specifically states, for those countries that have not transposed the 2008 decision framework, you're going to have infringement proceedings put upon you. And by September, we're going to have infringement proceedings put upon several of the member states. So what's infringement proceedings? What it means is the commission it's sort of a letter writing competition is what happens. The commission writes to a member state and says, you're in non-compliance, what are you doing? Report back to us how you're trying to address this issue. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And if the member state doesn't fix what they're supposed to be fixing, the commission can bring them before the European Union Court of Justice, like the Supreme Court of the European Union, and there can be fines imposed on those member states. So right after 2020, we're going to have 13 infringement cases that have been brought. 6 member states are now in full compliance out of those infringements. We'll see what happens with the other ones. They kind of keep it quiet. You can't research this stuff. They don't want to publicly, they don't want to embarrass these member states. So it's very hush-hush. You really have to dig to get this data, by the way. It took a lot of digging to find these. And I'm going to show you the list of all the bad actors. So just one of the really interesting things, if you say, well, does it really matter? Like, do those infringement cases matter? Did it make a difference? So I don't know if any of you are following the new government in Lithuania. But the new government in Lithuania is unfortunately, maybe I'm being a little political here, but a coalition with a far-right party called the Dawn of the River Naaman. And the leader of that party, and I have his name written down, and I do not speak Lithuanian, but the leader of that far-right party has made anti-Semitic statements. And because he made those anti-Semitic statements that could incite violence, he is actually under legal proceedings right now in Lithuania, under Lithuanian law. And if you look here at my list, Lithuania was one of those countries that had incorrect transposition, and now they transposed it. That means because of the EU, this guy now is under criminal proceedings for what he was saying. So, if you want to say like, does it make a difference? It can make a difference, okay? So these are all my bad actors, and you can see like some of them are still like letter of formal notice, like they're still going back and forth. They're not solved yet. So these are ones about hate speech and hate crimes, and these were the ones for criminalizing public condoning denial. These are the sort of Holocaust ones, okay? And you can see again, Lithuania was one of those countries, case closed in 2021, okay? So that was one of them that the infringement process worked, and now we have someone under those proceedings, okay? So you just get a little sense here of who are the not so good actors, but we can see that the EU has this ability to push member states to create laws to address anti-Semitism within their country. Okay, I have a little bit more time. Yeah, okay, we're good. I think I'm pretty good. I really want to talk about the online piece because I think it's really interesting, and I think particularly for all of you, it's something that it's part of your daily lives. You're probably all on social media, and you see all these things. So I want to talk a little bit about two components that have now sort of merged into one, and that is something called the Code of Conduct and the Digital Services Act. Let me start with the Code of Conduct because that emerges in 2016, and interestingly enough, the Code of Conduct emerged out of that. Remember I told you about that colloquium that Franz Timmermans put together in 2015 that dealt with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? The Code of Conduct also came out of that colloquium because they were realizing that this kind of hate speech is happening online, and like, how do we address it? So here's how the Code of Conduct works. It's completely voluntary. So the large platforms, social media platforms, like at the time that the Code of Conduct was first created, you had Facebook, you had Twitter, Instagram, and there were a couple other ones that joined in. It's a voluntary process. So these companies agree to be part of this. And then you have something called trusted flaggers. And trusted flaggers are third parties. They are people that are trained to find anti-Semitic content, Islamophobic content, anti-LGBTI content, all of that. And they specialize in it. And what they do is they monitor these large platforms, and then they'll flag something and say, hey, we found something Islamophobic, you need to take it down. And then the flaggers record how quickly did these companies respond, how much time did it take them, and every 6 months it's posted online. You can look. It's like a report card of all these companies. So it's a little bit of like public shaming, but there's no legal teeth to it. It's totally voluntary, as I mentioned. Now let's bring in the Digital Services Act. So the Digital Services Act was created in 2022, and it's gone fully into force in February of 2023. So it's very new. And the Digital Services Act is the EU's way of regulating social media and the internet. And I know we don't talk about regulating social media or the internet in the United States. The European Union is known for its regulating. It's what the EU does. So how does this work? The Digital Services Act, a big piece of it is addressing hate speech online. And some of the things that have been created, so the commission itself now has an institutional structure that oversees the larger platforms. So when I say larger platforms, it means 45 million users or more. So those are like the X, Meta, TikTok, those are the kinds of the large platforms. For smaller platforms and larger platforms, now member states also have a monitoring body at the national level that had to be created out of the Digital Services Act. So these, particularly the large platforms, not all of the DSA applies to smaller platforms, but all of it applies to large platforms. The larger platforms have to share what their algorithms are. Social media platforms do not like to do that, but according to EU law, they have to share it. And if one of these platforms knowingly, and this is the important piece, knowingly allows anti-Semitic speech, Islamophobic hate speech, knowingly allow that to happen, the EU can put fines upon them, and the amount is 6% of their global revenue. It's not a massive amount, but it's something, okay? It's definitely sizable, right? We're talking probably some billions here, okay? Now, this is all really new. It's still in motion. Not all of the pieces of the DSA are quite all in place because they're going to change the trusted flaggers a little bit, that the commission is going to be appointing newer trusted flaggers. So some of this is still in motion because they haven't decided how they're going to choose them. But to say, okay, does this matter? Does the Digital Services Act matter when it comes to addressing anti-Semitism? And I think what's really interesting is that I would argue yes. And in particular, you can look at, after October 7th, probably most of you are aware of this, but on X, there had been dissemination of disinformation, that there were images from like video games and other wars as if it was Israel going into Gaza. And of course, this is going to get people all riled up and all upset. And so the commission has, and it's still in motion, there are formal proceedings against X, and I believe also Meta, regarding dissemination of what is considered illegal content because it's false information that could incite violence. So we'll see what happens with this case. It's still happening, so I can't tell you, like, here's the outcome. But it's interesting that these companies can actually be held to task, that they can't, have this kind of, and knowingly have that content, okay? By the way, if they unknowingly have it and they take it down, they're okay. That's the way that the DSA works. So, a couple things here. Out of the EU strategy, it was recommended, and actually, not just recommended, you must, and of course member states can do or not do if they want to create national strategies to combat anti-Semitism. So 23 member states have established strategies, but the way they could do that is they could lodge it within other policies. Like some countries have like a xenophobia, like how to deal with xenophobia, and they put anti-Semitism in there. So that's where that number 23 comes from. But I think more interesting is that there are 14 standalone strategies, meaning 14 member states have created strategies to combat anti-Semitism. 20 member states have now appointed special envoys to address anti-Semitism. And 25 members, except for Malta and Ireland, calling them out, have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, okay? Again, if you have a definition, and we can talk about the definition and why is it problematic, but if you have a definition, you can create policy around it. That's why it's important that they adopt that definition. Some of the little outcomes, and then I'm going to open up to question and answer, but there's been a lot of money dedicated mostly to like third parties, to non-governmental organizations to address anti-Semitism. So for example, 5 million euro have gone towards security of various Jewish sites across Europe after October 7th. 11 million euro for programs dealing with citizens' equality rights and values. And one of those programs is called the Networks Overcoming Anti-Semitism, or NOAA. And that money goes out to, again, non-governmental organizations that are going out and training teachers in K through 12 schools, university professors, There's 26 million euro were dedicated between 2010 and 2025 to a European Holocaust research infrastructure. And this is an EU-funded project on Holocaust research that is going to be globally available. And it just, in January 2025, is to become a permanent organization. So again, you know, Holocaust remembrance is part of those pillars. There's a Young Ambassadors for Holocaust Remembrance program that the EU pays for. There is a European network of Holocaust memorial sites. It's made up of 3 million different sites across Europe that coordinate, talk to one another, so that these sites are maintained and they can share, you know, best practices and so on. One of the other really important things is that the Commission has worked a lot with what's called CEPOL. It's like the EU police training organization to train law enforcement of what is anti-Semitism, what does it look like, right? Because sometimes when something's a hate crime, if the police don't recognize it as a hate crime, it's not going to be prosecuted as a hate crime. They're also training judges to recognize when is something anti-Semitism, you know, when is it really a hate crime. So these are some of the, you know, some of the things that the EU, some of the tools that the EU has created to try to address anti-Semitism. And so just to conclude, I would argue that the strategy that the EU has created, it is a serious strategy. It is an attempt to create a policy to address anti-Semitism. So I think for that, it's a really positive thing. The challenge is, will member states implement it? And you know, it can be very much a mixed bag, as I've kind of pointed out to you, with having to, you know, get these member states to transpose EU law. And so the effectiveness of the policy is really going to depend on how member states implement it, and also how much the EU goes in and does oversight to make sure that member states are following the policy. There's lots more to be done, and we learned that after October 7th. There's no doubt that we have learned that after October 7th. But I think that this is a serious start. At least the framework of the policy is in place, and then the question becomes what member states and what the EU does to move it forward and have it make a real impact. So I'm going to end there, and we can open it up to questions.